What happens when an ordinary carpenter enters a stranger's house to simply repair the roof? He had no idea that someone had been waiting under that floor for days. What he heard, and what he decided to do, left the entire family on their knees before the truth. Warm, dusty slate lay on the slope of the roof. The boards were as old as he was. They creaked under his feet as if complaining. Matteo leaned his elbow on a beam and exhaled. The sun was shining in his eyes, and he squinted as if from someone else's gaze. He heard a dog barking below and a gate slam. Then children's laughter. Not his. He didn't look down. He didn't want to see who owned this house now. He was just fixing the roof. Not for the first time, not for the last. Nothing personal. Although he knew this attic by heart, there, under the tiles, he had once hidden a box of stamps from his grandfather. Here was the nail that had scratched his hand when he climbed up with his brother. And now that nail didn't recognize him. Matteo pulled himself up and picked up the hammer. The nails were in a tin bean can, perpetually dented and without a lid. He always did it that way. Everything the old way. It was easier that way, to remember who you were, and who you didn't become. When he went downstairs, the smell of fresh paint, new furniture, and someone else's scent hit his nose. Not dirty, just unfamiliar. The wallpaper was beige, sterile, and smooth. There were photographs on the wall. A young woman, a man in a suit, a baby in a jumpsuit. Everyone was smiling. Even the walls were smiling. "Is everything okay?" a woman's voice asked. The owner came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She was young, neat, with tired eyes. "Almost. One beam is bent, but I fixed it. It'll hold if it rains." She nodded quickly, businesslike. "Would you like some tea?" I wouldn't say no. Matteo sat down on the edge of a stool. He felt not at home, but like a guest who had not been invited, but was tolerated. Water was boiling in the kettle, and the ticking of the clock seemed louder than it should have been. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked, as if out of politeness. "As long as I can remember. Roofs last a long time if they're done right." The woman smiled, but it was forced, as if she had a thought in her head that she wanted to escape. When her husband returned, the door slammed shut. He walked into the kitchen and stopped when he saw Matteo. "Who's that?" "The contractor. He's looking at the roof," she replied curtly. "We pay for normal ones," he muttered as he walked past. He didn't say another word. He didn't even say hello. Matteo watched him open the refrigerator, take a bottle of water, and go into another room. It was as if he, the carpenter, wasn't there. He sighed and took another sip of his cold tea. "I'm sorry," the woman said quietly. "He doesn't mean any harm. He's used to everything being his," Matteo finished for her. "I know people like that." She looked away but didn't answer. She just put the cup away and went to wash the dishes. As he left, he turned around. The door, which he used to open as if it were his own, was now closed behind strangers. Everything in this house was new, except for the crack in the threshold. No one had repaired it. No one had even noticed it. He glanced at the facade, at the windows, at the attic where he used to hide letters from his mother, who had been buried quietly and quickly. Now everything was different, but why did it feel so empty inside? He turned, took a step toward the gate, and suddenly froze. From under the floor, muffled, as if from the basement, came a short sob. It wasn't a draft. It wasn't the wind. It was crying. Real crying. Lonely. Broken. We've only just begun this story, but it will become even more painful and true. Stay to see what a man who has been rejected by his own people is capable of. Matteo stood at the bus stop, under a canopy where peeling boards crunched under his feet. Next to him was a rusty trash can with a plastic cup inside. It was hot, but he didn't take off his jacket. Not because he was cold, but because there was a letter in his pocket that he couldn't bring himself to burn. The thin envelope, crumpled at the fold, smelled of dust and old times. No stamp, no address. He didn't open it because he knew there were no words inside. Only reproach, the voice of someone who would never call again. He went home, if you could call it that. A room in a workers' hostel on the outskirts, where the walls listened and didn't interrupt. The door creaked open, as if discouraging him from entering. He put his tools down by the door, walked past the mirror, where his reflection reminded him of his prematurely hunched back and the look that had forgotten how to wait. He sat down at the table and poured himself some water from the jug. The splash reminded him of his mother pouring soup from a pot into a bowl, placing it in front of him and saying, "Eat, even if it's bitter." He didn't understand then that she wasn't talking about the soup. An old clock hung on the wall, one he had repaired himself back in that house, when his younger brother threw it against the wall during an argument. The face was yellowed, the hands ticked crookedly, but they still worked. On the nightstand was a frame with a photograph. He was still young, wearing a shirt, holding his son in his arms. The child was not even 3 years old at the time. The photo had faded, like the connection between them. He did not know where his son was. He did not know if he wanted to know. He had tried once. He had written letters. He had called. He had left gifts at the door. And all he heard in response was silence, stretched tight like a wire ready to snap. Once, his son's mother, her lips pressed together, said, "You always kept quiet for too long. When you should have shouted, you left." He wanted to say that he had shouted inside, that his silence was not out of indifference, but out of fear. But the words stuck between his throat and his heart, and since then, they hadn't moved. He remembered how yesterday in the attic he had held that beam in his hand. His hand trembled, and not from fatigue. Something inside him twitched, as if this house was not just a house, and the book he had once closed without finishing. And now every page was someone's voice that he hadn't heard. The crying from the basement. He could still hear it. It was as if someone was still there. Someone, like him, had been unnoticed for too long. He got up and went to the window. There was nothing behind the glass, only trees that didn't recognize him. He watched as the shadow of a cloud slowly crept across the ground, as if time itself was hinting, "You're still here? But you're not you anymore." He sat back down, picked up a pen and a notebook, the very one he used to write orders and amounts in. Now it was just fragments of thoughts. He wrote, "If a house stops remembering you, it's not a home. It's just a roof without a foundation." He didn't know who he was writing to. Himself? His son? To the boy who hid under the table from his parents' quarrel and didn't understand how he grew up to be a man who was no longer called by his name? When it got dark, he remained seated. He didn't turn on the light. It's easier to see the emptiness in the dark. He knew he would return there tomorrow. Not because he had to, but because he couldn't help himself. The crying didn't stop. It remained under his skin. He could hear it even now, just as he had once heard his wife's voice crying through her tears. "You never asked how I felt. You just fixed the roof and kept quiet." And he really did keep quiet, because he was afraid to hear, "You're not needed anymore." We've reached the brink. What happens next will turn everything upside down. You can't miss the ending of this story. The next morning, Matteo woke up early, as usual. The sun had not yet broken through the curtains, and the room was already filled with the smell of yesterday's dust, metal from his hands, and the deafening silence to which he had long been accustomed. He didn't make coffee. He didn't waste money or effort on it. He just poured warm water from a thermos, bit off a piece of stale bread, and sat on the edge of the bed, pulling his socks on like armor. He was going back to that roof. Formally, the job wasn't finished. In reality, he could not go back. Crying. The same cry, hollow, as if coming from a dungeon, as if stuck between wood and stone, between a wall and memory. It haunted him like an itch on his back, where it wasn't the bone that hurt, but something ancient. When he approached the gate, the dog growled, but not loudly. It recognized him, or didn't want to bark. The house looked peaceful. The windows were wide open, the curtains fluttered, and the shadow of the cherry tree on the facade trembled like a breath. Everything seemed fine. Only the air itself was too smooth, too perfect, like in photographs where no one blinks. "You're early," said the woman, opening the door. Her name was Sophia. He hadn't asked yesterday, but today she gave him her name herself, as if there was something between them after all, even if it was just a shared tree on the roof. "Better early than in the rain," Matteo replied. He walked inside, as if into a museum of his own memories. "I'll finish up in the attic today, and I'll fix the drain. The wall on one side is getting wet." "We just bought this house," she said, as if out of turn. The real estate agent said it was warm with history, but sometimes it seems like it doesn't like us. He looked at her. Her face was covered with a thin web of fatigue, like cracks on a cup that was still kept in the cupboard, just in case. She was young but tired, not from work, but from some kind of inner wear and tear. "And history," he replied quietly, "doesn't always want to be remembered." He climbed up to the attic. The light from the window cut through the dusty clumps in the air like a scalpel. Everything here was both familiar and foreign. There was that beam. His father had once shouted not to touch it, but he and his brother had climbed up anyway. There was the corner, where his mother used to put boxes of winter clothes that no one wore anymore. Everything was left, except for the smell. Now it smelled of lime and construction foam. He began to work in silence. Nails, boards, a hammer. His hands remembered. His body moved without unnecessary words. But his thoughts would not be silenced. He remembered how this house used to smell of pies on Saturdays, and how his mother would curse at the radio because the songs are wrong again. How his father would fix the TV without talking to anyone. How his younger brother would shout that he would leave as soon as he could. And then he did. And he stayed. And in the end, he was left with nothing. Downstairs, a door slammed. Then a child's voice, laughter, then footsteps, uncertain, as if bare feet were sliding across the linoleum. Matteo froze for a moment. Then he picked up the board again. He had no right. That's what he told himself. He had no right to interfere, to remember, to disturb someone else's life. He had left, which meant he had given up. Whoever lived in this house now, it was their world. His world was gone. But then, why the hell was his heart beating not in his chest, but under his ribs, under the beams, in the floor itself? He knocked on the emptiness, and the emptiness answered. "Do you have a basement?" he asked as he descended. Sophia was surprised. "Yes, but we don't go there. It's old and cluttered. There's nothing but pipes and cobwebs." "Why?" "I heard a noise, maybe a cat or water." She nodded without thinking much of it, but her voice trembled when she added, "The child sometimes hears something too. He says someone is singing under the floor." Matteo froze. His lips tightened. His fingers tightened around the edge of his belt. He looked again at the door leading downstairs. It was closed. There was dust on the handle. He didn't say anything. He just made a mental note. Go downstairs in the evening. As he left, Sophia's husband was standing by the fence, a cigarette in his mouth, his eyes empty. "How long are you staying here?" he asked without greeting him. "Until it stops leaking," Matteo replied calmly. We don't really let people in. We don't like it when the old gets mixed up with the new. I'm not getting mixed up. I'm just fixing the roof. Mateo smiled. He knew it wasn't true. He walked along the path, feeling the air tighten behind him. This house no longer remembered him, but beneath the layer of new paint, the authenticity remained. And somewhere down below, in the basement, something was waiting to be heard. He returned in the evening, not because he had to, but because he couldn't do otherwise. All day long, he had been lugging tools to another site, working with metal, immersing himself in routine, like in a familiar noise, just so he wouldn't hear himself. But everything rang in his ears. A muffled, broken cry heard under the floor. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Towards evening, it started to rain. The walls began to draw moisture, and Sophia called him herself. Her voice was crumpled, as if she didn't want to call, but was forced to. He wasn't surprised. "There's water dripping in the bedroom," she said. "If you can, take a look." When he entered the house, it was already dark. The lights were off, except for a nightlight in the kitchen. Sophia met him in her bathrobe, the wet hair casting a shadow on her shoulder. The child was already asleep. Her husband wasn't home. Or maybe he was in the room where no one was expecting him. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Where's it leaking?" "Above the bed, right from the ceiling, dripping. Strange, it was dry this morning." He nodded. He walked inside silently. The room was clean and smelled of baby cream and dry laundry. In the corner stood a crib, empty but neatly made. Next to it was a chair with a book on it. Everything was quiet, as if the house had been holding its breath for a long time. He climbed onto the chair and touched the ceiling. It was damp, but not damaged. The leak was strange, as if it was localized, with no apparent cause. He listened, and he heard it again. The same crying, the same muffled voice, somewhere below, like a call from the ground. Not a scream, a moan, tired, human. He jumped off the chair and wiped his hands on his pants. "Do you have a basement under this part?" he asked. "Yes, but we don't go down there. My husband said it's dangerous. The floor is rotten." "Can I see it?" She hesitated. She went to the sideboard and pushed it aside. Behind the cupboard was an old wooden door. It had no lock, but the hinges creaked at the slightest movement. "It's dark in there. We don't go in there. My husband said it used to be a storage room with pipes. I don't know. Sometimes I hear noises, but I think it's my imagination." He didn't answer. He just took out his flashlight. When he opened the door, he was hit by a smell. Not rot, not mold, but stagnation. Like in a room where the windows hadn't been opened in a long time. Damp and heavy, it weighed on his chest. The staircase was steep, with flimsy railings. His footsteps echoed hollowly. He descended slowly, step by step. The light from the flashlight illuminated the walls, pipes, and cobwebs. Everything seemed normal, and yet, at the same time, unnaturally correct. Too empty. Too quiet. And then, suddenly, a sound. Not a scream. Not a cry. A sigh. He raised the lantern. In the far corner was a wall covered with plywood. New. Fresh. Clearly installed recently. Too smooth. Too out of place. He moved closer. He placed his palm against it. It was warm. Behind the plywood, it was warm. And there was movement, as if someone was leaning against it from the other side. He didn't scream. He just stepped back and stood there. "Someone's here," he said aloud. Silence in response. But not the kind of silence that is reassuring, the kind of silence that means someone is waiting. When he came out, his face was white. Did anyone live here before you? He asked quietly. Sophia cringed. We inherited the house. A distant relative of my husband's. We hardly knew him. They said he was strange. He lived alone. Mentally unstable, according to rumors. Did you look at his papers? Number. There was nothing there. He nodded. You need to open the plywood in the basement. She paled. Why? Because there's someone behind it. This is the climax. Everything you've been waiting for is right here. Stay and see how the hero puts everyone in their place. Matteo stepped out onto the porch. The air was sticky, as if the evening didn't know how it would end, with rain or silence. He lit a cigarette. He had quit many years ago, but he always carried cigarettes with him, as a reminder that he still had a choice. He stood there smoking, his mind racing. Not loudly, not like a thunderstorm, but like in the basement of an old house, creaky, hidden, almost ashamed. The same question kept spinning in his head. What if it's none of my business? Other people live in this house now. They don't know him. They don't call him by his name. They don't even offer him a second piece of bread. He's just a worker. He came silently and left silently. Whatever was in there wasn't his, right? But his heart thought otherwise. His heart remembered. What did you see in there? Sophia had asked quietly, following him out. He didn't answer right away. Plywood. New. Brand new. Someone blocked the passage. Or the room. It doesn't matter. It's not empty in there. Are you sure? He looked at her. Did you hear someone crying downstairs? She couldn't meet his gaze. She lowered her eyes. Sometimes. I thought it was the house creaking, or the pipes, or me. Or you were silent for too long. She shuddered. It was as if those words had struck a chord in her, something that had been hurting for a long time. You have a child. Would you want him to live above this? Silence. Then a hollow voice. No. Then decide. Because your husband won't. He'd rather paint over the plywood than ask what's behind it. He drove home but didn't sleep. He lay on the bed, his hands on his chest, staring at the ceiling, where mold painted strange shapes. His head was buzzing. His chest itched. Not physically. It was the kind of itch you get when you've spent your whole life pretending not to hear something. And then suddenly, you hear it. What if I go in and find out it's none of my business? What if behind that plywood there's not a person, but the past? Or worse, something that no one wants to open. He remembered how once, as a child, he heard his father talking to someone in the basement. Then the door was locked with 3 locks, and his mother said, "Sit quietly. Don't ask any questions." He sat. All his life. And now here he was, standing on the threshold. In the morning, he called Sophia. "I'm coming anyway, whether you want me to or not." I don't know how to tell my husband. Don't tell him, just step aside." She didn't answer, but she didn't hang up. When he arrived, her husband was home. He was standing by the car, checking the tire pressure, a cigarette in his mouth, his gaze averted. "No, hello, no, get lost." Just a short, "Why are you here?" "I'm going to finish the roof and check something." "No one asked you to check anything. You're working on commission. If you want to go into the basement, find another landlord." Matteo didn't answer. He just went into the house. He went down to the basement. Sophia was holding a flashlight. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't leave. "If you find anything there, we both know there's something there." He approached the plywood. He didn't knock. He just took a crowbar. And then, "Hey!" a shout came from above. Her husband was coming down, heavy footsteps, a wrench in his hand. "What are you doing there?" "I'm fixing it," said Matteo. "Get away from the wall, old man. This is private property." Matteo looked straight at him. Private? Are you sure? And whose property is behind this plywood? The husband froze. There was no fear or anger on his face, only desperate irritation, like a man who had been caught hiding the truth instead of trash. Sophia whispered, "I'll let him. If he doesn't want to, I'll let him. It's my house too." Matteo nodded. Then it settled. He raised the crowbar. The plywood creaked. The wood cracked so loudly that Sophia's shoulders shook. The dull crunch of plywood echoed somewhere between her chest and spine. It was as if he was breaking not a wall, but the silence that this house had carried within itself for too long. The first piece flew to the floor, raising dust. Behind it appeared another board, nailed unevenly, as if in a hurry. Matteo ran his hand along the edge, fresh. The nails weren't old. This had been done recently. Not 10 years ago, not 20, a couple of years at most. "Are you out of your mind?" shouted the husband. "There's just a pipe in there. I closed it myself. It's a storage room, damn it." "You haven't been in there," Matteo replied quietly but firmly. "And if you have, then you know what you're hiding." He pushed the crowbar deeper, and the second sheet of plywood gave way. Behind it, darkness appeared, black, as if it were not a room, but a chasm. It smelled of damp wood. Then, something else. Heavy, as if the air had been standing there for centuries. The husband took a step forward. "Hit it one more time and I'll call the police." Matteo turned to him. "Go ahead. But first, take a look at what you've nailed shut." He stepped inside. The room was cramped. The walls were concrete, unfinished. There was no furniture, only a mattress in the corner. It was dirty, stained, and sagging in the middle. Next to it was a cup. It contained dried soup, or porridge. Next to it was a notebook, and a bucket. There were scratches on the wall, lots of them, as if someone had been trying to count the days, or prove that they were alive. Sophia covered her mouth with her hand. Her breathing became ragged, her eyes widened. Her husband stood rooted to the spot. He wasn't breathing. He didn't move. Only his fingers were clenched into a fist. "Who was here?" she asked. It was. He faltered. His voice broke. "It was an old room. From back then, I just didn't want the child to go in there. It's not safe." "People lived here," she said. "Someone was here. Recently." He was silent. He stared at the floor. He didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. Only his teeth chattered like an animal cornered. Matteo bent down. He picked up the notebook. On the first page was a child's handwriting. Simple words. The letters were crooked, with missing endings. It was someone's voice. Small. Forgotten. Trapped between the lines. He closed the notebook. He didn't read it aloud. It wasn't his. But that was enough. "There was a child here," he said. "And not 20 years ago. Recently." The husband suddenly exploded. "You can't prove anything. This is none of your business. You're nobody. You're just a repairman. I'm a human being," Matteo interrupted. "And if you think this is none of my business, then say it out loud. To yourself, to your wife, to your child, and to the shadow that still cries in this house." He left the room. Slowly, without slamming the door. He didn't win. He just walked through a wall he didn't build, but still destroyed. Sophia remained with the notebook in her hands. Her husband stood motionless. The basement finally fell silent. But the house, for the first time in a long time, sighed. He left without saying goodbye. He just closed the gate behind him and walked along the ditch, where yellow leaves stuck to his boots. The boots were old, the soles were worn, but they held. just like him. Matteo didn't think or analyze. Inside, it buzzed like after an electric shock. It didn't hurt, but his body remembered. No one called him from behind. And that was right. It was a warm day, but he was shivering. He stopped at a cafe where he sometimes drank coffee. No one knew his name, but they nodded when he came in. Today was no different. The barista, a young woman who was always chewing gum, waved her hand. The usual. He nodded. He sat down by the window. The table was sticky. The cup had a chipped rim, and the spoon bent like the conscience of those who hide their children in basements. He smiled at the thought, listlessly, bitterly. A girl sat down next to him. She was about 12 years old, with red hair and a dusty coat. He had seen her before. She had been running past the construction site, waving as if they were acquaintances. Today she sat down next to him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Are you the one who repaired the roof?" He turned around. "I've repaired roofs in many places. It depends where." "Over there, by the cherry tree, where my friend's mom lives. Now they don't have leaks when it rains." He smiled. "So it wasn't for nothing." She tapped her finger on the table. "My mom said you're strange, but not mean," she said. "He's not one of us, but he stands up for what's right." "I don't understand what that means." Matteo took a sip of coffee. It was bitter, like everything else in life. "It means your mom is smart, and I'm just a man who's tired of keeping quiet." The girl chattered on. About school, about a kitten hiding under the shed, about how her dad lives in another house because he needs his peace and quiet. He listened. He didn't interrupt. At some point, he felt that no one had talked to him like this in a long time. Not because they had to, but because they could. "Are you always alone?" she asked suddenly. He wasn't expecting that. "Are you?" "Almost." "Well, then we're almost the same." She smiled. "Except I'm a redhead." He laughed for the first time in many days, genuinely, without a trace of sadness. "Redheads are the most stubborn. That means you'll definitely grow up to be someone who doesn't hide in the basement." When she left, he remained seated. A napkin was left on the table. On it was a drawing, a house with a large roof and a little man with a hammer. The caption read, "Thank you for not being afraid." He folded the napkin and put it in his pocket. This girl didn't know his name. She didn't know who he had lost, what he had done, how many times he had remained silent when he should have spoken. But she saw him as a person, not a function, not an age, not a profession, but a person who had stayed and hadn't turned away. He walked home. The wind grew stronger. Heavy clouds gathered in the sky, like thoughts before sleep, and somewhere inside, it became a little warmer. Not easier, but warmer. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that now, when someone called, he would answer. Because being heard is a luxury, and hearing is a choice. Matteo woke up not from noise, but from silence. It was strangely soft, as if someone had finally turned off the background hum that had accompanied him for years. He usually woke up feeling empty, as if each new day squeezed the meaning out of him. Today was different. He didn't feel different, but he felt that somewhere inside, something had shifted, a small click, like a nail finally falling into place. In the morning, he returned to the house with a roof, but not through the front door. He walked around the side of the property, looked under the floorboards, checked the drain, and reinforced a beam that no one had asked him to fix. He didn't expect any thanks. He just did what he knew. If the roof leaks, it's not the rain's fault. Sophia came out with a cup of coffee. Without a word, she set it down next to him. "I don't know how to talk to you," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. "We've already said everything." Without words, she nodded. She sat down next to him. For several minutes, they just sat there in silence, like people who were tired of explaining the obvious. "I read the notebook," she said. "There wasn't much in it, but it was enough." He didn't ask what exactly she had found. There was no need. He could see in her eyes that she had seen it. And now, there was no turning back. "And your husband? He's sleeping on the couch. He's silent, angry, pretending everything is under control. But I told him that if he didn't want to know, I would find out without him." Matteo looked toward the house. "So, the roof is still holding up." After lunch, he drove to an old woman he had known since his youth. She was a widow, a former neighbor of his parents. She ran a small shop on the outskirts of town, selling tools and spare parts. Her name was Agatha. "I didn't think you were still around," she said when he came in. "I was just wondering where you were." "Something's happened to your eyes," she smiled. "Either you've fallen in love, or you've finally found someone to bury." He laughed. "Neither. I just wanted to do something I wouldn't be ashamed of." She took out an old lantern, a pair of pliers, and even a folding ladder. "Take them. You can return them later. Or leave them at the cemetery." "Don't go there yourself," he muttered. "I'm not in a hurry. I'm curious to see how you finish this." He returned to the house and began to repair the fence, just because, without being asked, without payment. Sophia came out with the child. The boy looked up at him. "Are you a grandfather?" "Sometimes," said Matteo. "Do you have a home?" He looked at the sky, then at the cherry tree, which still had one green leaf despite the autumn. "I did. Now I'm not sure." The boy nodded. "Then this is your home too." Sophia watched silently. There were no tears in her eyes. Something else. Recognition? Or pain that was finally shared. In the evening, the three of them sat down to dinner. Her husband was not there. He had gone somewhere. Sophia did not comment. The boy ate his soup, looking at Matteo's hands, calloused, stained, scarred. "Did you hit someone?" "Myself. Often. For keeping quiet. Mom says you saved someone. I just opened the door." The boy shrugged, as if that was all there was to it. Just opening the door. After dinner, Matteo stayed. They sat in the kitchen, listening to the water dripping in the sink. No fuss. No rush. Sophia said, "I thought no one came here anymore just like that. Without a purpose. Without malice. But you came. You stayed." He looked at her hands. They were thin and tired. But there was something strong about them. He nodded. "Because if you start with the roof, you can build the walls." Before going to bed, he walked around the property once more. He approached the basement. He listened. It was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not oppressive. The kind you can fall asleep to without fear of waking up. He didn't know how long it would last. But now, on this evening, he felt something shift inside him, deep down. And it never went back. On the third day, everything went downhill. Matteo arrived early, as usual, with a bag containing his tools, an old rag, a sandwich with a boiled egg, and a note he couldn't bring himself to throw away. The words had faded, but he knew them by heart. "If you ever want to talk, I'll be waiting." Signed, his son's name. Once upon a time. He sat down against the wall of the house, checking the frame. Everything seemed fine. There was almost no work to do. The house was holding up. The beams were standing. There were no leaks. But inside, it was as if it had started all over again. Sophia was pale. Her eyes were downcast. "He left last night," she said. "He packed his things. He didn't explain anything. He said, 'I don't belong here if you believe that.'" Matteo wasn't surprised. He didn't want to see. People like that don't stay when the truth is staring them in the face. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, she sighed. Have you ever done anything right and been happy at the same time? She smiled wryly, almost bitterly. Never. They sat down in the kitchen. The child was in the room. The house was filled with a ringing silence, not because no one was there, but because no one needed to lie anymore. For the first time. I looked at the documents, she said. The house belonged to my husband's cousin. He had a criminal record, not for theft, for something else. She faltered. For holding a minor. He was found insane. They put him in a clinic. Then he died. They hushed it up. The house was inherited. My husband didn't know, or he pretended not to. Matteo clenched his jaw. He felt the ground shifting beneath his feet again. So it was always there. Sophia nodded. I don't know how long the child was there, who he was, where he is, if he even exists. But the room wasn't empty. I heard it. Matteo looked at her. Do you want to know the whole story? I have to. They went back down to the basement, silently. No drama. The door in the plywood wall was now open. Inside was the same emptiness. A mattress, walls, a notebook. But now, there was a letter. On the floor, in the dust. Not a sheet of notebook paper. An envelope. Old. Worn. With drops on it, as if someone had held it with wet hands. The handwriting was childish. There was no name on it. Just a phrase. For whoever hears this someday. Sophia handed it to Matteo. He didn't know why, but his hands were shaking. He tore open the envelope. The paper was thin. The handwriting was shaky. Faded. I don't know who you are, but if you are here, then I wasn't here for nothing. I don't know why I was forgotten. Probably because I wasn't important. But if you are reading this, please don't go away. Don't be silent. Tell someone that I existed. And tell them that it wasn't my fault. Matteo read to the end. Slowly. Aloud. Sophia covered her mouth with her hand. Her shoulders shook. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. My God, she whispered. He could have been. He could have, Matteo nodded. Just like mine. He went out into the street. A cool wind hit his face. He closed his eyes. Long. Deep. Something inside him tightened. Something he had buried for decades. He remembered how he had once slammed the door when his son was screaming hysterically. How he hadn't come back after that night. How he had remained silent because it was easier that way. I knew, he exhaled. All this time I knew someone was calling me. But I pretended it wasn't my voice. He didn't cry. He just stood there, and he heard the wind whispering through the branches. You knew. You knew. You knew. He woke up that morning feeling like his chest was filled with bricks. His heart beat dully, wearily, as if warning him, not today. But he got up anyway. As always, he put the kettle on and sat down on the edge of the bed. The walls in the room were pressing down on him. Not physically, mentally. As if every crack in the wallpaper was reminding him, you were silent too. Like them, he thought. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he shouldn't have gotten involved. The phone rang at 9 in the morning. It was Sophia. Her voice was muffled, as if she were underwater. He's back. Matteo was silent. He started yelling as soon as he walked in. At the child. At me. He said you turned us against him. That we're all crazy now. That you stick your nose where it doesn't belong. And you? I kept quiet. Why? Because he was always like that. I didn't know there was any other way. he exhaled. "Do you want me to come over?" "No," she said. "Not yet. I have to do this myself, but if I can't, will you be there?" "You." She said, "you," again, as if taking a step back, as if everything they had done together had been erased by a single male scream. "I will," he said. He walked around all day as if he were underwater. He went into a store where he used to buy hardware. The saleswoman didn't recognize him. An old man they had worked with on a construction site walked by and turned away. At the bus stop, 2 teenagers giggled when they saw his hands covered in oil. He suddenly felt like he wasn't a carpenter. He felt like a ghost. He realized that when you take a step toward the truth, everyone who lives a lie starts to growl. In the evening, the same man approached him. On the street. Without warning. Without a word. He just sat down next to him on a bench, as if they were old friends. "You know," he said, without looking him in the eye, "you're no better than us." "I never thought I was better. You just want to be good, but it's too late. And you want to be right, but it's too scary now." They sat in silence for a long time. "Do you think I knew everything?" the husband finally asked. "Number, I didn't know. I just didn't ask. I didn't want to. And when I found this room, it didn't matter anymore. The main thing is not to get involved. What if it had been your son?" He turned to him. His face was contorted, his lips trembling. "Don't talk about my son. Don't you dare." "Why? Are you afraid he could have been the one who wrote the letter?" "Shut up," the husband shouted and stood up. "You're not my family. You're just a stranger. And you break everything." "I don't break anything. I'm just not ready to prop up someone else's rot anymore," Matteo said quietly. When he returned home, he felt as if all the walls were closing in on him. And not his walls. The ones that had grown inside him. The silence he had lived with for so many years was now screaming. He remembered how he had once silently turned away from his brother, who was crying on the phone, begging him to just talk to him once. How he hadn't gone to his father's funeral because there was nothing to gain there. How he built himself a basement, without doors, but with thick walls, and he nailed everything he had ever felt inside it. And now it was knocking back at him. Before going to sleep, he took out that very napkin with the picture of a house and the words, "Thank you for not being afraid." He held it in his hands like an anchor, and then he wrote on it, "I'm scared, but I'm coming." And he put it on the table. Tomorrow he would return, if there was anyone waiting for him. He sat in the workshop he had built himself, once upon a time, for his son. Back then, he still believed that his son would be there, holding the nails, asking questions. Then just for himself, so that he would still be needed somewhere. Now it stood half empty, covered in dust, smelling of machine oil and dry rags. The tools were neatly arranged, as if no one had touched them for years. And that was almost true. He looked at his hands, rough, warm, tired. Then he looked at his phone. There were no messages, no calls. Not from Sophia, not from his son, who hadn't called in years. Not from his brother, who had left and said, "You buried me before my mother did." He remembered seeing Sophia's husband through the window yesterday. Again. With a bag, a cigarette, looking like a winner, as if the house was his fortress again. He didn't go there, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that he had already done everything he could. Everything else was not his battle. He suddenly felt clearly that he was alone again, not because the world was evil. It was because that was how he was. People quickly forget those who pulled them out of a hole, especially if they return there themselves. He went to the old bridge behind the village, there where he used to jump on the rocks as a child, catch frogs, and eat bread with salt. The river was shallow and muddy, like his entire past. He sat down on the edge. The wood creaked beneath him. His heart seemed to stop, from exhaustion, not from pain. He remembered his son, how he had once shouted, "You can't hear me. You're always silent, as if you don't exist." And he really was silent, because he thought silence was not conflict. It turned out to be disappearance. He opened the notebook where he had written down the names of those he had ever repaired things for. There were many, hundreds, addresses, dates, notes, but not a single word about himself, not a single line. Here I felt needed. He stood up. The wind hit his face, cool, almost sharp. He realized that no one would call him. No one would come. No one would say thank you, because the people he had saved were already building new walls. Walls of silence. He returned home. He sat down in the dark. He didn't turn on the light. On the table lay a napkin with a drawing. The same house with a roof and a caption. He picked it up, crumpled it, and wanted to throw it away. His hand trembled. He straightened it out after all. Not because he believed, but because he couldn't throw away the only thing that was real. He whispered into the darkness, "And I thought I was still needed." And suddenly, in that silence, where everything seemed dead, he understood the main thing. He didn't want to be a hero anymore. He didn't want to save those who would later forget him. He didn't want to repair roofs if evil was hiding underneath them. He just wanted to leave. At dawn, he packed his bag. Nothing extra. He left the key to the workshop on a nail. Everything else could rot. If anyone was looking for him, he was on the roof. But the roof was now closed. He walked along a country road where no one had driven in a long time. Clay stuck to the soles of his shoes. Grass clung to his legs like foreign memories. A bag on his shoulders, not a single useful thought in his head. Only fragments. Pieces of phrases he had heard once, but had not had time to respond to. "You didn't ask how I feel. You always kept quiet for too long. You just want to be good. But it's too late." He walked, past the old courtyards where he used to run barefoot with his brother, past the abandoned booth where they smoked their first cigarette. Everything was the same, but he wasn't. His body felt foreign. His muscles ached, as if he were carrying not a bag, but his entire past. He reached the bridge. He sat down. It was the same bridge. Rotten, but still standing. Like him. He took out his notebook. He opened the first page. There was nothing there, just a blank sheet, like the life he hadn't filled. He wrote, "I don't know who I've become. I just became nobody because I kept quiet." Next to it was another line, written by someone else. He remembered how his son used to write, awkwardly but with character. Sometimes out of spite, sometimes just to say, "I'm here, Dad." And him? He stood in the doorway, silent, as if it were a choice. And now? Now silence had become his language. Only no one was listening anymore. The wind stirred up dust. A gust of air brushed his cheek. He closed his eyes, and he saw a scene, forgotten like a rusty noose. He was standing outside the house. His son was in tears, 10 years old, screaming, "Why don't you ever ask? Why aren't you angry? Why do you just leave?" He replied, "Because I'm afraid that if I speak, I'll ruin everything." "You've already ruined everything," and the door slammed shut. Back then, and now, inside him, he sat on the bridge, his back to the water, his face to the wind. And suddenly he thought, what if back then I had said something? Even if it was just, "I'm sorry." Or, "I don't know how either." Or, "I wasn't taught how to love." He opened his bag. He took out the napkin, the one with the picture of the girl on it. A house, a roof, a little man with a hammer. Thank you for not being afraid. He looked at it as if it contained a code, and he finally understood. He was still alive. Old, tired, a stranger, but alive. And if he was alive, that meant he could speak. He stood up. Slowly. His knees creaked like boards. He walked back. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if his son would forgive him. He didn't know if Sophia still needed him. He didn't know if there would be a place for him in this house. But he knew one thing. He would no longer be silent. Not to himself. Not to those he loved. He no longer wanted to be convenient. He wanted to be alive. He returned in the evening. The same house. The same gate. Only his gaze was different. The street smelled of burning leaves. Someone was burning trash at the end of the street. Gray streaks hung in the sky, as if the evening didn't know whether it would be mild or stormy. Matteo approached the gate. He knocked, as if he were a stranger, because he still wasn't sure if anyone was waiting for him. Sophia opened the door. Her eyes were red. Her hair was messy. Her face was pale but calm, like someone who had spent the day on the edge but remained standing. "You came," she said. Not a question. Not a greeting. Just a statement. He nodded. "I need to tell you something." She stepped aside and let him in. The house smelled of soup and something else. Words that had finally been spoken. A boy was sitting on the floor, playing a silent game, moving toy cars around in a pattern on the carpet. When he saw Matteo, he didn't run up to him, but he didn't run away either. He just nodded, like an adult accepting someone else's shadow. Her husband wasn't home. Sophia said quietly. He left. For the first time. On his own. No hysterics, no slamming doors. He just said, "You chose sides." And I said, "I chose the truth." She sat down at the table. She put a cup in front of him. "You wanted to say something, didn't you?" He exhaled. "I always thought that if I kept quiet, there would be less pain. But it turned out the opposite. I lost too much. My son. My family. Myself. I didn't come here to fix the roof. I came to hear at least one voice that isn't afraid to speak." She looked at him as if for the first time, not as an old man, not as a carpenter, but as a person who had reached out at the right moment. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't just break the plywood. You broke the fear." He smiled. "I didn't break it. I just stopped propping it up." The boy came closer. "Are you staying?" He didn't know what to say. Sophia looked at him. "You can. If you want to. There's a lot to fix here. Not the roof. The rest." He nodded. Slowly. Quietly. "I don't fix roofs. I fix silence." That evening, the three of them sat together, without loud words, without plans. There was tea, bread, and honey on the table. The napkin with the drawing was lying nearby. The boy took a pencil. He finished drawing the house. He added a window, and then a little man on the porch. "That's you now," he said, "only with a shovel." "You'll still help us, won't you?" Matteo didn't answer. He just smiled, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at home. The next day, there was a knock at the door. Not loud, but insistent. Sophia opened it, and there he was, standing on the doorstep. Her husband. His face gaunt, a plastic bag in his hands. He looked tired and restrained. Behind him stood a car with the door open. "I want to talk," he said. Sophia didn't answer. She just stepped back. Matteo was sitting in the kitchen drinking tea. Her husband noticed him, his eyes narrowed, but without the same fury. Only a dull heaviness remained, as if the anger had gone, but the guilt remained. "I'm not after him," he said, not looking at Matteo. "I'm after you." Sophia crossed her arms. "I didn't kick you out. But you left. Because I didn't know what to say. He faltered. "I didn't know what to do when it all suddenly became real. I thought you would close your eyes, like you always did. But I opened them. I was scared. I'm sorry." Silence. It pulsed with truth, not reconciliation. The boy peeked out from around the corner. "Daddy?" Her husband crouched down. "I'm not a good person. And maybe I'm not even needed. But I want to try to be better." Sophia looked at Matteo, slowly, as if searching for an answer. He didn't take his eyes off her. He just said, "You don't need yourself, not until you admit that inside you're not a man, but a boy who's afraid to hear it's your fault." Her husband looked away, but he didn't leave. "Can I stay?" Sophia nodded. "If you don't run away from the basement anymore." Later, when the three of them were left alone on the porch, Sophia, her husband, and Matteo, silence hung between them. But not the same silence as before. It was new. Clean. "What about the basement?" her husband asked. "I'd leave it," Matteo replied, "but not as a secret. As a reminder." "Of what?" That even silence once cried. Together, they carried the notebook, the letter, and the plywood to the shed. The boy asked, "Why keep the bad things?" Sophia sat down next to him. "Because bad things aren't always evil. Sometimes they're just things that no one dared to name." At sunset, Matteo went out into the yard. The trees rustled in the breeze. The cherry tree was old, but still alive. He ran his hand over the bark. There was an old notch on the trunk. His. Many years ago. He took out a knife and carved a new one next to it. I was here, and I heard. On his last evening, he was in no hurry to leave. Sophia made dinner, and the boy fell asleep on the sofa. Her husband washed the dishes, just like that, without a word. Matteo went out onto the porch. The stars were shining in the sky. He thought how strange it was. There was so much pain in this house, but for the first time it felt peaceful. Sophia followed him outside. "Thank you." "You're welcome. You did everything yourself. But you didn't turn away." He nodded. "Once upon a time, I didn't have anyone who would stay." He gathered his bag. In the morning, he set off, not forever, but with the feeling that now he had more than just a roof over his head. He had a home. Finally. The morning was quiet, not deafening, not anxious, just calm. The kind of morning when a house doesn't scream through its walls or press down with its corners. He woke up before everyone else. He packed his bag, went to the sink, and washed his mug. Slowly, without rushing. He left it upside down, letting the water drip out drop by drop. The kitchen smelled of yesterday's dinner, slightly rotten cherries, and home. Warmth. Uncontrived, without loud promises. Just a home that had let someone in again. He stepped out onto the porch. The air was thick, slightly damp, but not heavy. A board creaked under his feet, the one he had never replaced. Not because he had forgotten, because it was now part of this story. Just like him. Matteo looked back. The windows of the house were still dark. Everyone was asleep. And that was fine. There was no need to say goodbye. There was no need to explain. He just nodded, to himself, to this house, to this cherry tree, on which one last leaf still clung, stubborn, and he walked away. He walked along the same road he had come, but now it was easier. as if something had been left behind. Not thrown away, but passed on. Not forgotten, but heard. A bag on his shoulder, a napkin with a drawing in his pocket. Silence in his chest, but not empty. Lived. He was just fixing the roof, but it turned out he had fixed much more. And now, it's holding. Would you have opened that door or walked by? Write one word in the comments. I'm listening. If, like him, you can't stay silent when someone calls. We read every story, and maybe someone will hear you too.